Good afternoon. Welcome to US-Japan Research Institute seminars on the topics of US-Japan, and China Trilateral trade in Imbroglio. What is after the East Japan Great Earthquake? And my name is Katsuichi Uchida, president of this USJI and also the vice president of Waseda Universities. And USJI was established jointly by 5 leading Japanese universities, namely Kyoto, Keio, Ritsumeikan, Tokyo, and Waseda universities, in order to provide policy-oriented research, academic research result to wider audience here in the United States. And we have an office in the at 1875 High Street. And since the inaugural seminars in March 2009 in Tokyo, every September and February we have a USJI week here in Washington, D.C. And this week and the last week, under the title, the general title of the reconstruction after the Great East Japan Earthquake, we have 5 seminars, 2 collaborative lectures, open house, and social networking receptions. This afternoon, we have a seminar 4. And Japan has produced many good, efficient, competitive manufacturing goods, such as automobiles and computers. And we produced 6 prime ministers within the last 5 years. And we are proud of our high productivities of prime ministers. And September 2009, at the first USJI week, we have Prime Minister Hatoyama. Then last September, Prime Minister was Mr. Khan, and this time Prime Minister is Mr. Noda. And among these 3, 2 of them are graduates of our member universities. Prime Minister Hatoyama was graduate of the University of Tokyo, and in case of Mr. Noda, he is a graduate of Waseda Universities. This afternoon, the title of our seminar is, as I will explain, the trade relationship between US, Japan, and China after the earthquake. And we are very pleased that Professor Nakatsuji, he is also the advisor to the USJI and professor at the Ritsumeikan University, is the moderator of this seminars. And we have 2 presentators, both from Ritsumeikan University. Professor Yamagami, he is also the vice president of the Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University, and also Professor Sasada of Ritsumeikan Universities. And we are very fortunate to have a discussant, Dr. Mark Manga. He is a lecturer at the London School of Economics, and he has experience of visiting scholars at the Institute of Social Science at the University of Tokyo. And so I'd like to ask the Professor Nakatsuji to moderate this session. Thank you very much. Professor Nakatsuji.
Thank you, President Uchida. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the session concerning political economy of Asia Pacific trade negotiation. As President Uchida has introduced all the panelists already, I will make it brief. Probably I need a little bit of addition to his introduction of panelists. Professor Yamagami sitting next to me, Vice President of Asia, Nismeka Asia Pacific University. He has been long time, he was long time official of Ministry of Justice in Japanese government. He was sent to State Ministry of Foreign Affairs for 3 years from Ministry of Justice to participate APEC negotiation. So he has he was a practitioner as well as very distinguished scholar. And, sitting next to Professor Yamagami, we have 2 young Turks. That doesn't necessarily mean that Professor Yamagami and myself are old, but we are simply just less young. Professor Sasada, he's another very promising young scholar. And, he wrote his doctoral dissertation about 1940s system. Post-war economic growth with Japan was more or less designed during wartime or even during Manchurian era. A very ambitious study. And, Professor Manga took PhD at the University of British Columbia, and he contributed to article to our book published a few years back, and kindly that he agreed to join this session despite a rather short notice. Usually Americans start speech with jokes, but Japanese start the speech with excuse. And I have to do Japanese practice today as well. Originally, we intended to invite one Chinese scholar, Professor He Pin from Fudan University, but because of sudden turn of events, he was unable to come. I sincerely apologize for his not coming. But obviously, 3 panelists will fill the vacancy which Professor Hippen has made. We will discuss not only about Japan, but we'll discuss entire Asia-Pacific region, especially in terms of trade liberalization. Unfortunately, I think last few years, especially this year, we are suffering, especially advanced, almost with no exception, advanced economies has been suffering economic difficulties. Probably one important keyword is sovereign risk, which obviously means governmental debt, serious situation of governmental debt. But I rather propose to use this word in a little broader way in my introductory presentation. If we are talking about the United States, as we have already experienced that President Obama had a difficult time to raise debt ceiling because of difficult negotiation with U.S. Congress. And the Japanese government obviously suffers from piling governmental debt as well, in addition to serious damage caused by a great East Japan earthquake. And stagnant economy is another factor. And as President Uchida mentioned, that we have changed Prime Minister 6 times in 5 years. So we had 6 prime ministers in 5 years, and unfortunately they came and they had come and they had gone without achieving almost any meaningful result. And the new as for the new Prime Minister is concerned, Prime Minister Noda simply has mentioned that he wanted to act like Lodge. And that means that he's ready to do lots of groundwork in a muddy water of political arena. That much we know about him. We don't know what is his trade policy. By the way, I rather recommend to eat eel instead of loach. Eel is much tasty. And so political, both countries plus EU are suffering. All advanced economies are suffering from political difficulties. And to get out of this economic stagnation, obviously we need to incorporate the vitality of emerging Asian economies. And that's what we intend to discuss today, how to incorporate Asian economic power for mutual benefit, both for Asian nations and Japan and the United States. Professor Yamagami will discuss about origin as well as evolution of Asia-Pacific regionalism. From time to time, he touches upon East Asian community idea as well. Obviously, history of Asia, history of regionalism of this area has problem of identity. From time to time, it was headed toward East Asian regionalism. Now we are talking about TPP, which is more Asia-Pacific type of regional building. But the Professor Yamagami will set the record straight, tracing back the regional trade dialogue since late 80s. He will clarify where did sort of regionalism come from and where would it go, and he will clarify current state of regional dialogue concerning trade liberalization. While Professor Yamagami will discuss international aspect, Professor Sasada will discuss about domestic dynamics, especially concerning Japan, whether we really have sovereign risk, or should I rather say more straight way that lack of leadership in Japan might obstruct trade dialogue among Asia-Pacific nations. And he will focus on DPJ, Democratic Party of Japan, trade policy. Whether DPJ is a promoter of trade integration or whether it is a rather stumbling block for regional trade agreement. And Professor Manga will provide his comments to two presentations today. And I would like to open the discussion to the floor later on. So let's begin our discussion with Professor Yamagami's presentation.
Thank you, Professor Nakatsuji, for kind introduction. And I'm honored to be given a chance to deliver 20 minutes speech on trade and investment liberalization in the Asia Pacific. As all of you are aware, WHO Doha Development Round is hopeless to come to terms and many countries are now exploring regional and bilateral FTAs as a second best in a sense. And the Asia Pacific is not the exception. Today, my presentation is review how the Asia Pacific region try to cope with the situations and also convey some future perspectives. If we review the trade policies, investment policies in the Asia Pacific, or countries in the Asia Pacific, we can say they are globalists in general. The United States and Canada are the founding fathers and guardians of that system. Also, East Asian countries achieved economic growth under non-discriminating multilateral trade regime under GATT succeeded by WTO. All initiatives and proposals to promote regional cooperation in the Asia Pacific from the 1960s, right? Pacific Trade and Development Conference participated by the academicians in 1960s, Pacific Basin Economic Council, that's by business people, or Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference Council in 1980s. All of them called for maintaining and strengthening that system. According to the research done by Ministry of International Trade and Industry in 1997, among the top 30 economies, only 5 East Asian economies didn't conclude any preferential trade agreement. Those 5 economies are Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And they preferred global multilateral trade regime under GATT. They don't want to weaken the global system. What kind of concern that East Asian countries had around 1990? That means Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation was convened in 1989. How the countries of East Asia saw the political economy there. First phenomenon was intensification of trade frictions, trade disputes. In those days, trade talks between the United States and Japan was annual routines. Well, like strategic impediments of Japanese market, or voluntary curb of export of cars, or how to handle with the semiconductors of the United States. Those are intensive discussion between two countries. And these trade talks were also done between United States and Korea, United States and Taiwan, and other East Asian countries. Since 1986, that rule round started, but towards the end of 1990, when the 4 years term of that rule negotiations was intended, there was no progress, slow progress, or statement of that rule round, which irritated many countries in the world, particularly East Asian countries. And also at the same time, protectionist or regionalist move detected in Europe, like Single European Act, and eventually it came to the EU in 1993, or NAFTA in North America. From the eyes of East Asian countries, manufactured products in East Asia may be excluded from all over the world. And also, incidentally, end of the Cold War might divert FDI from East Asia to Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, or because of NAFTA, FDI may be moved toward Mexico. And scenario of East Asian countries by inviting foreign direct investment and enlarging the production capacity and exporting the products and achieving economic growth. This pattern might be in danger That kind of perception was enjoyed by many East Asian countries in those days. On the other hand, the United States, US concerns around 1999, huge trade deficit with Japan, ANEs, and other East Asian countries, dissatisfaction with trade policies and practices of EC and Japan. On the case of EC, and as many of you are aware, common agricultural policy of Europe, or export subsidy. That was a severe discussion between EC and the United States. Towards Japan, as already discussed, trade surplus, or how to liberalize Japanese domestic market, or how to sell American semiconductors to Japan. Those are the issues. Or the rice issue. How to force Japan to open the market of rice. After the end of Cold War, the major US policy challenges were on the economic and other domestic fronts, like economic disparity or trade disparity between Japan and the United States and Europe, or illegal migration, drugs. These domestic issues came to the front of US policy challenge. At one occasion, Harvard project for Asia and international relations was convened in Tokyo a few years ago, and at that occasion, one American scholar told and explained, when the NAFTA was the issue in the United States, she said she was persuaded NAFTA is necessary, otherwise illegal migration from Mexico would not stop. She said, despite NAFTA, flow of illegal migration didn't stop, and we are cheated, or we are wrongly persuaded. My reaction to such thrust of argument was, unless NAFTA existed, perhaps illegal migration issues would be much bigger today. Now, regional responses around 1990s, formation of APEC, that's, in other words, inclusion of the United States, and the role and function of the United States for the Asia-Pacific region was most important for this region as a whole. At a similar timing, in 1990, Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir proposed to establish East Asian Economic Group to Lipen, then Prime Minister of China. And this proposal was severely opposed by the United States. Now, according to the Malaysian explanation, East Asian countries have common necessity and common concerns. And therefore, East Asian countries should talk together, should act together, should speak in one voice. Therefore, we are going to force some talking groups among East Asian countries. What's two concerns? Well, a global market might be inward-looking, or Eastern Europe and Soviet Union might take larger foreign direct investment. And such was the concern of the East Asia. And the necessity is to speak in one voice, to act together. But the United States reacted to this proposal, saying that the United States could not approve to divide Pacific Ocean into two, and Japan and the United States belonging to the different group cooperating against each other. And due to such US oppositions, the concept of EAEC, East Asian Economic Caucus, was shared by ASEAN countries. views and actions on trade liberalization in APEC. Since the start of APEC, all of the countries, including in the United States, they put importance of global trade regime. And the other part of the issue is unwillingness of East Asian countries to negotiate like GATT rule around in balancing the sectoral benefit disadvantages and APEC process. In 1990, trade ministers meeting was convened in Vancouver just in the year when GATT rule around was supposed to finish. Didn't finish, but in 1990, trade ministers meeting was convened, and then Carl Hills, American U.S. trade representatives, put forward urging some compromise among these 12 countries. She was very straight. All of us agreed the importance of global trade regime, and we all knew that some compromise be needed for early successful conclusion of global round. If we 12 countries can agree, that formula would be presented to global agenda, and that would be perhaps adopted, because we 12 countries enjoy majority of global GDP, and we include both agricultural product producing countries and importing countries, both developed countries and developing countries. However, ASEAN countries, Japan, Korea, all these countries are not prepared to negotiate under the APEC process. Negotiations should be done under GATT rule around in general. So such an opportunity was not utilized, and instead, APEC ministers issued a series of declarations urging the countries concerned to come to terms at earliest occasion with widest range for GATT rule around. In 1994, APEC leaders agreed on Bogor Declaration on regional trade and investment liberalization so as to complement the GATT regime. Now, Bogor Declaration made it clear. In 1994, the leaders from APEC members made political commitment to implement trade and investment liberalization by 2020 for developed countries in the region by 2010. Bogor Declaration is not a legally binding document, though. Now, what happened to APEC during these days? Well, incidentally, GATT rule around was concluded 1993-1994, when the EC and the United States came to the terms on dramatic reduction of EC export subsidy on agricultural products. On the side of APEC, in 1992, APEC ministers agreed to establish eminent persons group to explore the modalities for trade liberalization in the Asia Pacific. United States nominated Fred Bergstein as an eminent person for this group. Japan nominated Okta Saburo for this group, and all countries nominated one person as an eminent group for the trade liberalization. And this group proposed to the APEC leaders in 1994 two things. One is, immediately after conclusion of GATT rule around, global community should convene another global round for strengthening global trade regime. The other is, in order to complement global regime, regional trade and investment liberalization should be promoted in the Asia Pacific region. And following to the recommendation of eminent persons group, APEC leaders adopted this political commitment to implement trade and investment liberalization. In 1994, target year 2020 or 2110 may be a little bit far, but by closing to the target year, this political commitment may be seen with keen interest by various groups. However, again, this Bogor Declaration is not a legally binding document. Therefore, how to achieve this political declaration is the issue. Modalities to achieve the Bogor goals. First is concerted voluntary liberalization through individual action plans and peer review. The other is to select some sectoral areas, early voluntary sectoral liberalization from easy sectors. Through these two combinations, APEC members try to achieve trade and investment liberalization. However, as I put note, Japan could not cope with marine and forest projects, which led to the standstill of this process. Already in 1997, new WTO round was expected, and if some compromise be needed for Japan, marine and forest products may be the subject of a concession at the global round, not here. That's the kind of the thinking of the Japanese ministers. On the other hand, United States came to show its concern on the extent of voluntary liberalization. What voluntary liberalization can do would be limited. Hard negotiation through legally binding document would be needed for meaningful trade liberalization. In the meantime, again, in 1997 was the year that East Asian countries faced difficulties. East Asian currency economic crisis took place in summer 1997 when Thai baht was the subject of the abrupt withdrawal of foreign investment. And such crisis spread immediately to Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, and others. In that year, the first ASEAN Plus 3 summit was held. And in order to overcome currency economic crisis in East Asia, regional cooperation was seen with necessity. Then, ASEAN countries and Japan proposed to establish Asian Monetary Fund, which was not supported by the United States and declined by China then. However, regional cooperation was felt urgent necessity, and as written here, so-called Chiang Mai Initiative to establish currency swap agreement between ASEAN countries and Japan, China, and Korea. Initially, that was bilateral currency swap agreements, but later expanded and also set into the multilateral trade regime. And this kind of development promoted other cooperations in East Asia under the framework of ASEAN Plus 3. In 2000, ASEAN side proposed East Asian Summit and to explore East Asian free trade and investment area in East Asia. Then many countries or many people thought ASEAN Plus 3 framework may be automatically elevated into East Asian Summit. But that was not the case. When the East Asia Summit was convened in 2005, East Asian Summit was held back-to-back with ASEAN Plus 3, and East Asian Summit included Australia, New Zealand, and India. And from this year to the East Asia Summit, United States and Russia will join. How to define East Asia may be something different, but functionally speaking, role and responsibility of the United States is still quite important. Now, what kind of FTA, EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement in the Asia Pacific is explored? Now, of course, NAFTA, ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, and other regional FTAs, US Central American FTA, and others. Bilateral FTA, EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement between ASEAN countries on the one hand, China, Korea, and Japan on the other. All these bilateral FTA between ASEAN and Northeast Asian three countries are already concluded. FTA between Korea and the United States, I may briefly explain its implication. But FTA between Korea and the United States was concluded a few years ago, but so far American Congress didn't endorse this FTA. Exploration of regional FTA under the context of ASEAN Plus 3 East Asia Summit, and also exploration of FTA under the context of APEC, sorry, under the Bogor Goal. As I mentioned before, when the Bogor Declaration was adopted, the target year of 2020 or 2010 may have been considered a little bit far. However, in 2001, the APEC members agreed to sum up the progress report as a midterm report in 2005, and in 2005, APEC senior officials submitted a report, and APEC summit noted the following points. The average tariff rate that APEC members actually applying in 2004 was around 5.5%. The relevant figure in 1989 was 16.9%, while nearly half of the members were applying below 5% rate. APEC members already concluded 53 FTA EPAs at that stage. And APEC summit agreed that FTA EPA should be highly qualified and transparent and must be compatible with other agreements so as to contribute to comprehensive liberalization towards the Bogor goals. APEC members should liberalize trade and investment by 2020 for developed countries by 2010. That's last year. How to reach the Bogor goals? Actually, those who decided to convene APEC summit in Japan in 2010 last year and 2011 this year in the United States, Hawaii, those who consider this order of APEC host certainly had in mind that while Japan and the United States host this summit in this order, somehow leave the Bogor goals, and that's the Hawaii summit, whether APEC could adopt basically on the agenda of TPP, which is now on the agenda. Certainly, Professor Sasada will further explain would be the key for leaving the Bogor goals. In 2006, P4, New Zealand, Chile, Singapore, and Brunei agreed to establish FTA without exception. In those days, this was called P4 proposal. The initiative came to be named Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, to which the United States, Australia, Malaysia, and others joined for negotiation, which aims to conclude at APEC summit in Hawaii. Now, in Yokohama last year, Japanese Prime Minister Khan mentioned that Japan would seriously consider to join this process as early as possible. Earthquake postponed the Japanese final decision, but what kind of conclusion that new cabinet come to the fore would be seen by various people with keen interest. My final PowerPoint is exploration of FTAP in multi-layer fashion. TPP will be most critical as one of major driving forces for achieving the global goals. FTA proposals in East Asia also coexisted. ASEAN plus 3, East Asia Summit, and Northeast Asian 3 countries. I may mention briefly on this proposal. Recently, Japan, Korea, and China, their leaders agreed to expedite the FTA negotiation among these 3 countries, which irritated US counterparts. Why? Because Japan is promoting FTA between Japan, Korea, and China, while not deciding whether to join TPP yet. From some people in Japan, between Japan, Korea, and China, shelving the agricultural products, it's a temptation. They don't have to get through tough domestic politics. But nonetheless, in order to reach the goals and also to stabilize the relations in this region, Japan and the United States should be in the same process for trade regime, and that would be the key to this region. Now, final note, the United States-Korea FTA may have some implication for potential FTA between the United States and Japan. I put this because in the US-Korean FTA, rice was shelved. If rice issue can be shelved, some, I should not be too optimistic, but FTA between the United States and Japan may be also promoted, even if TPP as a whole may not come to the conclusion. But again, when the US-Korean FTA was signed, immediately a few days later, chief negotiator on the side of the United States made press briefings and said, if US and Japan may come to negotiation for FTA, that FTA should be no exception, because Japan and the United States, both economies are very big, and with establishing some exceptions may cause trade diversions, and that's an issue for the region as a whole. But we have to see very carefully on the outcome of toward APEC summit in Hawaii this year. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Yamagami. Probably we share the same sentiment among all of us that story is quite complex and lots of drifting. And, it reminded me of a very old song of Beatles, A Long and Winding Road. But thanks to Professor Yamagami's description, a few very important missing links were connected. For example, TPP, we have learned TPP has a lot, Trans-Pacific Partnership has a lot to do with APEC. And Bogo Declaration is not forgotten either. When Bogo Declaration was announced in 1994, I remember that I talked with a Thai scholar. Probably this declaration doesn't mean much. By 2010 or by 2020, most of the leaders are either dead or gone, with possible exception of Indonesian Suharto, but he's gone too. But anyway, we are not quite sure where we are going from now and whether we can achieve a long-standing, meaningful result out of regional trade dialogue. That really depends on active participation each major economies, including Japan. That part, Professor Sasada will discuss. Professor Sasada, please.
Well, thank you, Professor Nakatsuji, for kind introduction. And I'd like to thank USJI for giving me the opportunity to present my talk here. And then also like to thank everyone here on the floor to participate our panel. Professor Yamagami just presented sort of a broad view of a trade relationship in Asian Pacific region, and I understand my task is to present a microscopic sort of analysis on trade policy in Japan, and then I will focus on the nature of the current ruling party in Japan, the Democratic Party of Japan, or DPJ. The title of my talk is End of an Urban Party, which refers to Democratic Party of Japan, and Japan's FTA policies and DPJ. And let me give you a brief overview of my talk today. In recent years, there's sort of a worldwide trend towards free trade policies, and a lot of attempts have been made, as Professor Yamagami have mentioned, in various parts of the world. And many countries have signed some form of bilateral free trade agreements, or FTAs, among major trade partners. And also there is preparation for the negotiation for a multilateral free trade arrangement called Trans-Pacific Partnership. And Japan is no exception to this type of trend. Japan has negotiated with some of its trade partners to sign or negotiate FTAs, and Japan has signed some of them. However, the Japanese government, under the leadership of LDP, or Liberal Democratic Party, has been rather reluctant to promote free trade policies. And this another party, the DPJ, Democratic Party of Japan, has been calling for major shift in the Japanese trade policies in their campaign pledges. And DPJ finally won the lower house election in 2009, and you would expect that the Japanese government will finally make a major shift in trade policies. However, so far it's been 2 years since the power shift. However, you haven't seen much changes in Japan's trade policies, and then the DPJ government seems to be struggling or unwilling to sign FTAs with its major partners. So the major topic in my talk today is what explains DPJ's struggle or unwillingness to sign FTA after the power shift in 2009. And so, like I said before, there's a worldwide trend for free trade arrangement in recent years. There's a significant increase in the number of bilateral FTAs. In the last 10 years or so, there has been over 100 FTAs signed between among many countries, and then the total number of FTAs today is over 170. And countries do so in order for them to strengthen their global competitiveness. And also another reason for this global trend is the disappointment by many countries with the multilateral or global free trade agreements. Like Professor Yamagami mentioned, WTO has been quite unsuccessful in reaching a tone and further liberalization of trade. And then also APEC has been struggling in recent years. And therefore, many countries are looking at bilateral arrangement as an alternative to this global or regional arrangement. And the Japanese government has under the pressure to catch up with some of those trade rivals in the Asian region, most specifically South Korea. Because South Korea has been very active on this issue and then signed FTAs with its major trade partners, namely ASEAN, EU, and the United States. That gives tremendous disadvantage to the Japanese industry because Japanese companies in many areas directly compete against South Korean companies. And therefore, the Japanese business is pressuring the Japanese government to first forward its negotiation with its major trade partners to sign FTAs. The Japanese government, as you know, has been controlled by one party until 2009. The party was LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan. LDP has been quite reluctant to engage in free trade arrangements, and it strongly it refused to include, for instance, agricultural commodities and multilateral trade negotiations like the Doha round of WTO. And also, even though Japanese government under the leadership of LDP has signed some FTAs with some rather smaller trade partners like Mexico, Singapore, and so forth, that Japan didn't sign any FTA with major agricultural producers like the United States or Australia. That's mainly because LDP government wanted to protect Japanese agricultural business. And also Japanese government, under the leadership of LDP, had provided various trade protections for farmers. Japan's average tariff rate on agricultural products is rather low. If you look at the average number, it's about 11%. So contrary to many conceptual understanding, Japan has opened up its agricultural market to a large extent. This number is lower than some European countries, not as low as the United States, but it's about average among the OECD countries. However, if you look at certain commodities like rice, wheat, dairy products, and sugar, those commodities are highly protected. Rice, for instance, has a tariff rate of about or more than 700%. So the Japanese rice market is, as you know, strongly protected. The part of the reason for the protectionist policies kept for such a long time by the LDP government is partly because of what's called malapportionment in the Japanese election, or in Japanese it's called something like Imbroglio. And it refers to the fact that rural districts are overrepresented in the Japanese parliament for the Diet. You have more seats allocated towards the rural areas than urban areas. And so you have more politicians elected from rural areas. And LDP is a rural-based party. And so many of its members are elected from rural districts. And it relied heavily on the rural votes to maintain its power. And therefore, it is natural that the party was very sensitive to rural interest. And so in the agricultural policy-making process, it's often explained by looking at this concept called iron triangle in agricultural policy area. Iron triangle is a sort of a clientelistic relationship among three major actors, namely the farmers, agricultural co-op, which is the biggest agricultural interest group in Japan, and the LDP, the ruling party until 2009. Let me briefly discuss what this iron triangle look like. You have the farmers. The Japanese farmers are quite small in size. Their farmland is about, on average, of 3.0 hectare, which is so much smaller than farmers in United States or Australia or other major agricultural producers. And therefore, the farmers in Japan are naturally non-competitive. It relies heavily on the government subsidies and this agricultural group, or Nokyo. Nokyo is the agricultural co-op in Japan, and practically all of the Japanese farmers are members of agricultural co-op. Agricultural co-op does mainly two things. One, it provides business assistance to farmers. It does pretty much everything for the farmers, except for the farming. And it provides farmers with business consultation, or it does marketing for the farmers. Farmers sell their products to Nokyo, and then Nokyo sells in the market. So farmers don't have to worry about advertising or marketing their products. They provide finance or loans to farmers, or they even provide insurance and other kind of financial commodities to farmers. So the farmers can just go to Nokyo, and then they can continue their agricultural business. And also, the other function of the agricultural co-op is to function as a political machine. It functions as a lobbyist group. It mobilizes rural votes of their farmers and family members of the farmers. And basically, they tell the farmers to vote for the Conservative Party, or LDP. And then also, they actively lobby in the government in order to advance the interest of the farmers. And finally, you have the LDP, which had the power until 2009 and developed this sort of a clientelistic relationship with Nokyo and the farmers. So in exchange for farmers' vote, the LDP made the government to provide such things as trade protection and price support, subsidies, and huge investment in infrastructure development in the rural areas. So a lot of people, a lot of scholars interpret this relationship to explain why Japanese government continue to provide protectionist policies. The DPJ was the largest opposition party in Japan up until 2009. And in their campaign pledges, they called for major shift in the trade policy, or major shift in the Japanese government, including trade policies. They criticized the LDP for clinging into this protectionist trade policy for a long time. And in DPJ's campaign pledges, or their manifesto, they called for promotion of free trade, removal of trade barriers, and participation in FTA for the sake of market competition and strengthening Japan's global competitiveness. And then also, the other sort of pillar in DPJ's trade policies was what's called the income support program for a farming household, which is the idea to shift the focus of government's agricultural policies from price support to income support. So by removing price support programs, which try to sustain the prices of rice and other agricultural products at the high level, by removing it, you shift into income support for the farmers. The idea behind this was, if you remove the price support on agricultural products, the price of the agricultural products will go down in Japan, and it will be beneficial for the consumers. At the same time, you can still provide assistance to the farmers, as the government provide income support for the farmers. The party argued this is more consistent to market principle. And this sort of policy is more common among the other OECD countries. And if you look at their manifesto or campaign pledges, I'm sorry, I only have it in Japanese, but I'll translate it for you. The first one was a document published in 1999. In the first paragraph, they argue that the DPJ trust market principle and advocate free trade and free market. There's another one published in 2003 before the lower house election. It said, and at the bottom, it said the party will aggressively promote FTA as a means to strengthen Japan's global competitiveness. So, and then if you look at other manifestos or campaign pledges of the party, you see these kind of promises again and again. And like I said before, the party finally defeated LDP in the lower house election in 2009 and came to power. And so you would expect that they will make a major shift in Japan's trade policy and promote free trade policies. However, it's been 2 years since the power shift. However, there has been only 2 FTAs signed by the Japanese government. And then those FTAs or the negotiation of these FTAs are started before the power shift. And there hasn't been any new FTA negotiations with the major trade partners after the 2009 power shift. And then the party hasn't decided whether to participate or not the TPP negotiation yet. So you don't see much difference in the party's or this new government's policy than old government's policy. So once again, the puzzle is what explains DPJ's struggle or unwillingness to sign FTA after the power shift in 2009. And there has been many studies on Japan's trade policies looking at various factors. Some scholars look at international factors, like international or multilateral free trade arrangements, or WTO framework, or regional arrangements. Other scholars, group of scholars, they focus on domestic factors, and myself is included. Some scholars look at electoral system as one factor to explain the trade policy of Japanese government, or lack of leadership, interest groups like Keidan, which is the biggest business interest group in Japan, or the Nokia, that one I mentioned before. However, the existing studies, they focus mainly on LDP policies or policy making under the LDP government, because it hasn't been much since the power shift, and not much about the DPJ yet. So in this talk, I'd like to present an argument to explain DPJ's trade policies by looking at the nature of the party, or the party structure, and change of it since 2009. Like I said before, DPJ has been calling for free trade for a long time. And that can be explained by the fact that the DPJ was an urban-based party up until 2007. And represented urban interests. And therefore, it was calling for free trade policies, which will benefit the urban interest, residents in the urban districts, who works for big companies, or consumers, and so forth. And DPJ for a long time was believed to be as an urban-based party, and then there was a word called the first district phenomenon to describe this urban-based nature of the party. It refers to the fact that the party won the majority of the first districts of prefectures in Japan. The first districts are most urbanized districts in each prefecture. However, since 2007, they had upper house election, and DPJ won a big ton. And since then, DPJ became reluctant in promoting free trade, because DPJ now is not an urban-based party anymore. And I argue that it became, or the party's total success in 2007 and 2009 made the party a catch-all party, just like LDP used to do. So let me give you some data to suggest, to indicate, to support my argument. This first figure illustrates the DPJ's members elected from urban district and rural district. And this is a number from the upper house. As you can see, up until 2007, the DPJ had more members elected from the urban districts than rural districts. And interestingly, since 2007, this number is pretty much the same. And they had another upper house election in 2010. Once again, the number is the same. And if you look at the lower house, numbers from the lower house, you can find the same kind of trend. This figure indicates the percentage of members of the parliament, MPs, elected from the first district. DPJ won more than LEP in first district. Once again, first district one of the most the most urbanized district in each prefecture. And so that's why there was a term first district phenomenon. It was true up until 2005. DPJ was winning more in first district than LDP. Up until 2009, if you look at 2009, the number is pretty much the same for DPJ and LDP. And also, if you look at this figure, this indicates the percentage of members of DPJ elected from either from urban district, suburban district, or rural district. As you can see, up until 2000, well, if you look at numbers from 2000 and 2003, it's true that this party was basically urbanized party. Majority of the members were elected from the urban districts. But since 2005 and 2009, the number got much smaller, and percentage of members elected from the rural district got so much bigger than it's more than doubled from the number of the year 2000. And this is a number from LDP. LDP, consistent with the common belief, it's a rural-based party. Some 36.5% of the members and about 40% were elected from the rural district up until 2003. The number got smaller in 2005 because of the success of the Prime Minister Koizumi, who was very popular in urban districts. So they won a lot in the urban districts. So the number got bigger. But once again, in 2009, this number of the urban elected members got smaller because DPJ did very well in the rural districts in 2009. So going back to figure 3, this increase in the number of the rural elected members in a DPJ is explained by its success in the rural districts in 2009. And then also you can see a division in DPJ administration. If you look at first and second Khan administration, you can find some members are elected from urban district, and therefore they support FTAs. Prime Minister Khan is elected from Tokyo number 18 district, which is a very urban district, and therefore Mr. Khan was a very strong supporter of FTA. And then also other major members of the Khan administration, such as Mr. Maehara, also elected from urban district, MITI Minister Mr. Kaeda, and Economic Minister Mr. Yosano was also from urban district. And these members were strongly supporting FTA. But also there were a group of cabinet members who strongly opposed FTA. Like Agriculture Minister who served in the first Khan administration, Mr. Yamada, elected from a very rural district in Nagasaki. He was a very strong opponent of FTA or TPP, and there are other vice ministers in the agricultural ministries who were elected either from rural district or suburban district in agricultural prefectures like Niigata or Nagano, who also represented a rural district. And that is another factor of DPJ government's hardship in promoting free trade agreements. And this for I prepared this PowerPoint last month, but as you know, there has been a lot of changes in the DPJ government, so I had to add one more slide, which is the Noda administration. If you look at Noda administration, it's also divided. Mr. Noda is from Chiba number 4 district. It's an urban district, so he does support FTA. However, if you look at other people like Mr. Genba, he's a foreign minister. He's elected from Fukushima number 3 district. It's a rural district, but Mr. Genba is rather more understand. He support FTA to some extent, even the fact, even though he was elected from the rural district. But if you look at other people like Mr. Tachiya, who just resigned as a MITI minister a couple days ago, who was elected from Hokkaido number 4 district. It's a suburban, but it's agricultural prefecture. And then he was considered as a person who was not very supportive of FTA, but he was replaced by, to make things more complicated, he was replaced by Mr. Edano today, or yesterday, and so I had to add this part too this morning, but Mr. Edano is from an urban district, and so he seems to be more supportive of FTA, but you have the agricultural minister like Mr. Kano. He's from a suburban area of agricultural prefecture, Yamagata, and so once again you see this division within the administration. And also you have this post 311 factors. The Tohoku region of Japan was devastated by tsunami and earthquake, and then also by the radiation. Tohoku is a major agricultural production region of Japan, and therefore a lot of farmers, as a result, is in a very difficult condition. And so there's a strong demand on the Japanese government to provide agricultural protection. But at the same time, the Japanese industry is having even harder time than before 311 because of the appreciation of the yen, and then also the electric shortage within Japan, which is making it very hard for the Japanese companies to continue their production activities within Japan. So many companies are thinking about relocating their production sites from Japan to overseas sites, which may lead to massive layoffs. And therefore, there's a pressure on the Japanese government to promote FTA in order to discourage Japanese companies from relocating their production sites. In conclusion, I just want to summarize what I have just said. The factors within the DPJ hasn't been studied so often in studies of Japanese trade policies, but it has a significant impact on Japanese government's trade policies. DPJ has transformed from an urban-based party to a catch-all party, and therefore, the influence of urban-based members of the DPJ is increasing, making it very difficult for the government to promote or materialize the free trade policies. And then also, there's a division within the party, which I didn't mention too much in previous slides, but there's a division between the mainstream of the party and the Ozawa faction, or the members of the DPJ called Ozawa children, who are mostly from rural divisions or rural districts, and then they present the rural interests, making it very difficult for the leader of the party to have strong leadership. And lastly, this problem of a malapportionment in the Japanese election has not been changed much. And therefore, if the party wins the majority, and inevitably increases the number of the members or politicians elected from the rural district. And therefore, whether it's the DPJ or LDP who gets the majority in the lower house or upper house, makes it very difficult to promote free trade policies. And I would like to end my presentation here, and then I'd like to thank everyone for listening to my talk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sasada, Professor Sasada. While Professor Yamagami depicted regional trade negotiation with his characteristic optimism, Professor Sasada conveying current state of mind of Japanese had explained Japanese politics in a somewhat pessimistic way. It is indeed duplicable if DPJ is taking the simply populist stance, following up LDP's policy. It has protected not only farmers but their position as ruling party. And if DPJ is simply following LDP's policy, what's the point of partisanship? That's sentiment that many Japanese internationalists share. But Professor Sasada has at least pointed one optimistic, bright point, which is resignation of protectionist Hachiro of METI, Ministry of Economy and Trade and Industry. Edano is well prepared in our perspective for coming TPP negotiation and APEC summit in Hawaii. Another optimistic aspect of Japanese is that historically speaking, that Japanese has been ready to listen to outside view from actually Komodo Perry, who opened Japan, who probably has no blood relation with the current Texas governor. And to name a few, Dr. Reichel or Ezo Vogel, Professor Vogel, and now I think we are ready to hear from other non-Japanese view about Japan's trade policy and East Asian, Asia-Pacific regional trade dialogue. Let me introduce Professor Mark.
So, many thanks for mentioning me in the same sentence with Commodore Perry and Professor Reichel. Okay, I will keep my comments relatively brief. So, Professor Yamagami was seconded to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1990, and he guided APEC issues there for 3 years. During this time, the Bogo Declaration was developed with the then, and of course even today, still ambitious goal of free trade among developed APEC members by 2010, last year, and 2020 for developing country members. It's important to note, by the way, that the Republic of Korea is a developing country by WTO definition, right? So presumably within the same in the APEC liberalization. So as I read this paper, I was struck by some parallels between back then and what we see today. So when APEC was created and the Bogor Declaration emerged, the multilateral negotiations process seemed to have reached a dead end. And APEC was clearly devised as an alternative venue for trade liberalization. So most members, nonetheless, certainly the Japanese government, were keen to make it GATT compatible and to use APEC to propel the multilateral process forward. And the fact that APEC seemed to create momentum towards trade liberalization has had a profound effect in European negotiators, right? Probably an exaggeration to say that APEC was midwife to the birth of the WTO, but it certainly helped focus the minds of negotiators by demonstrating that if the Uruguay round failed, key countries in the Asia-Pacific had an alternative. And this emphasis on GATT compatibility was also positive in the sense that it made clear that whatever regional integration schemes would be devised, they would not undermine the multilateral trade liberalization process. So the key term at the time was open regionalism. And Professor Yamagami's paper recalls the origin of this without mentioning the term explicitly in the 1990 Senior Officials Meeting in Singapore. Now, of course, if you take this seriously, if you say we really want open regionalism, then it's actually politically almost impossible. Because if you limit the benefits of trade liberalization to the APEC members, right, almost all GATT members, right, except for Vietnam and China at the time, then you can only do so under Article 24 of the GATT, and form a regional trade agreement. And that means elimination of substantially all trade barriers. And clearly, many APEC members, including Japan, were unwilling to do so at the time. Right? And if you do not form an RTA, this Article 24 of the GATT, then you need to extend all trade barrier reductions to all other GATT members, which means giving the European Union a free ride. Now, this, to me, seems to be the problem with all these declarations that follow the war, including the Osaka Action Agenda. Because if APEC members had actually gone ahead with this liberalization, that would have implied these extending this to all other WTO members. So in that sense, there's kind of, a fundamental defect in the construction of this idea. Nonetheless, there is a striking parallel. So today we have this East Asia Summit, which starts out as ASEAN +3, and eventually India, and Australia, and New Zealand are added, right? So it's ASEAN +5.5, sort of. Then Russia and the US are invited, and we're pretty soon back at all the APEC membership, right? It's the same countries. You kind of bury this footnote, this in a footnote, actually. I think it's such an obvious parallel that you kind of might make this stand out more. But there's something else you underline. So there's a compromise that's found in the Uruguay round, and Asian governments see NAFTA and the Single European Act, where both negotiated, this all happens in the same time frame, right, early 1990s, as creating regional blocs. But in this, it sounds as if Asian countries refrain from forming a regional grouping to avoid undermining the GATT and WTO, and the US and the European countries then decide to form their own exclusive regional arrangements. Now, I'm not sure that's such a fair interpretation, because negotiating meaningful trade agreements among East Asian countries proved difficult, still difficult. And there are as many, this is important when we think about what's going on in East Asia, there are as many FTAs by East Asian economies with partners outside of the region as there are among Asian countries only. Which is very different from what's going on in Europe and the Western Hemisphere. Another sort of interesting thing, fact that emerged from this analysis was, so there were so many proposals for regional liberalization. They all originated with the ASEAN countries, and they also kind of suffered from the ASEAN problem. There's lots of pronouncements, and there's no real implementation. And I always found it sort of troubling to make the jump from the ASEAN style of cooperation to an Asian way of regionalism based on consensus decision-making, because consensus in ASEAN and consensus in Japanese politics are completely different things, right? In Japan, it takes forever to make a decision because of consensus has to be found, but once it's done, the policy is then actually implemented. In ASEAN, it takes forever to make a decision because consensus has to be found, and then everybody goes home and nothing is implemented. So it's fundamentally different, really, the diplomatic approach here, if you will. And I thought this, 2005 midterm review of just reinterpreting the Bogor Declaration to mean something completely different, a bold move. Okay, so the world has moved on. We have many FTA initiatives in place or in the negotiation at the moment. So the goal shifts towards facilitation of trade and investment, recognition of standards, customs procedures, and other domestic measures. And most people would probably say, that's kind of uninteresting. There's no bold political initiative here. But actually, this is really something that businesses on the ground can benefit from. Possibly more than from another initiative that talks about integrating all these countries. You have this patchwork of all these agreements. So by definition, you have different rules. Let's just think about tariffs, right? Which is something that which you think is sort of the easiest thing to deal with, just a number, because we already have a harmonized system of definitions. And I've spent a fair bit of time lately working out these different tariff definitions, and there is real potential for making these easier. So for example, if a Japanese schedule in an FTA regularly lists sort of a specific tariff category, and then lists a tariff, and then it lists a different category for a specific product, which is then has a different tariff or is excluded. That's usually something that is protected in Japan. Then that gets a different tariff. It's most often the case in agricultural and fisheries products. Korea does exactly the same thing, right? They have the tariff, and then they have a subcategory with a specific product that Korea protects. And then you look at these lists, it gets extremely confusing, they're extremely long, it must be terribly difficult to administer them for the customs, but it also must be very difficult for exporters to figure this out, because in the subcategory has the Japanese name of the fish, and then the subcategory is the Korean name of the fish. And, I certainly couldn't make sense of it. I'm not in the business of exporting fish, but there's room for facilitation. Then finally, the TPP membership and the participation of the US, Canada, and Australia in the negotiations. So if there are negotiations, then we can already tell that the TPP is being watered down. The whole point of it was that there wouldn't be any negotiations because it's free trade, right? It just means we have no more trade barriers. It's the only real free trade agreement in the world that deserves the name, right? So there's nothing you need to negotiate to join. Say, well, we don't have any trade barriers. Well, so they are being negotiated, which means new rules have been introduced. Nonetheless, if you have these countries on board, I think it would be just as difficult for Japan to join as it would have been to conclude back then, in 1993, with a few changes, of course, which leads nicely to Professor Sasala's paper, which addresses the fundamental puzzles of the DPJ since its formation, has portrayed this image of an economically liberal party and recognizing that pork barrel politics were essential to the LDP government. The party had liberalization of markets, including agriculture, as a key element of its policy platform. So there's a number of things that have to keep in mind. So there's a lot of sort of consumer rights advocates who are DPJ politicians, and also, of course, strategically, right? If you undermine this pork barrel politics system that the LDP had created, you actually undermine their rule. But then, the key to the resounding victory in 2009 is due to a large expansion of the number of seats won in rural constituencies. So the DPJ has transformed itself from an essentially urban party to a more comprehensive party. This has the consequence of making it impossible to pursue these liberalizing policies, particularly the negotiation of war FTAs. Now, what I found really, really interesting was how many of the new, so supposedly EU DPJ members and cabinet ministers from rural black backgrounds were actually old-style politicians, sometimes actually former LDP members, all of them with strong ties to the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries. And it seems like these party differences are almost irrelevant because in this aspect, the election system remains extremely personalized in Japan, and in rural constituencies, what matters is that you can deliver the goods from Tokyo and in return you get the votes. Right? That's still the case. The only thing that has changed is the party that does it. So, that makes intuitive sense when you read it. There are a number of other studies that you mentioned, and what I find very striking is that I'm not sure how to adjudicate these different explanations. So, for example, this Solis paper makes essentially says, well, the outcome is the same, but she says, well, there's a lack of leadership. So why is it? And this is probably something that all of us who are watching Japanese politics from the outside, why is it so difficult to impose this? Anything like party discipline. Even stay on the same message, not make cabinet ministers can be at least can't even be expected apparently not even stay on the same message, but not make utterly stupid remarks and then be forced to resign. It is absolutely astounding to me that this seems to be completely impossible for the DPJ. But a few sort of specific questions that I had here. How do we know that it is the rural constituencies and this need to get the votes there that is really the explanation, and not what the DPJ politicians would probably say, which is, well, we're dealing with the bureaucrats and they're just not doing what we need them to do. There's a struggle with the bureaucrats. No matter who's the prime minister, they can't impose their will on the bureaucracy. And you could say, well, that's because the Ministry of Agriculture is still so powerful. So they would veto any serious FTA negotiation. Second, the DPJ wins its majority by expanding into rural constituencies, and this kind of begs the question, why did the LDP abandon this turf, right? There must have been something that rural voters would change their allegiance at this point, and I'm wondering, what were these policy platforms of rural DPJ candidates that convinced voters to switch? Right? Did they say, well, you see, the LDP has become a liberal party, they're actually undermining, negotiating all these free trade agreements, and we won't do this, which of course would be the opposite of the general party platform. There's something that convinced them, right? Overall, of course, this is an Ozawa strategy. This is Ozawa strategy. Many of the rural candidates, so they're Ozawa's children in the 60s often, but that's okay. It would be interesting if you could sort of actually just, match this up. Just tell us, give us more than a few names. Just say, so of these rural constituent or MPs elected from rural constituencies, how many would we sort of say are Ozawa followers? Because that's points to one of these really, really interesting questions about the future of Japanese politics. Don't just apply to free trade agreements, right? But how can the DPJ form some kind of winning coalition in the broader sense? I mean, party coalition, but just sort of have voters who actually vote for them, and not stretch itself between these different policy camps that are really, the DPJ is so far, the members are so far apart on so many issues, and then you have no party discipline built into the system, and it's incredibly hard. In fact, if they are so far apart, and then you have these people from rural constituencies who vote for completely different things, then it's not enough for the DPJ to convince the LDP to work with them, which they're not going to do anyway, or to drag Komeito into the camp and then form a coalition, because the intra-party dissent is going to remain such a big problem. So, last point, so the individual income support or household income support system, right, that's been implemented, that should have an effect, right, at some point. Is it too early, maybe? And that's why we haven't, or is this, I mean, you would think about this as, once this is in place, you can actually negotiate free trade agreements and liberalize agriculture, because it doesn't matter anymore if you can sell your Japanese rice, because the income actually comes through the system, right? And of course, that makes it somewhat transparent to the Japanese voter that these people are actually getting their money from taxes and not, some other way. But I think that was the idea behind the system, right? To disconnect these two. Okay, so in closing, it seems to me the DPJ cannot implement policy unless it imposes direction and bureaucracy, and it cannot implement any, or it cannot even pass any policy unless it passes some, creates some more inter-party discipline. So we invite you to speculate, but it doesn't matter now that we've seen the latest cabinet shuffle, right? It's sort of, I mean, the best thing you can say about Noda, aside from his sense of humor, apparently, is that he's not an obvious man of either of these two wings, which is really, there's not two wings, there's pro-Ozawa and against Ozawa. So what can we see, what can we expect from him in this policy, right? He is from an urban background. Well, urban background, right? There's no, he's from Funabashi, right? There's no real reason to go to Funabashi unless you need to shop at IKEA in Tokyo, which I did once. Fascinating. Products are absolutely identical to every other store in the world, IKEA store, except that everything is Japanese. But does it matter, right? What can we expect from Noda? Can we expect now maybe that he will try to implement some discipline, or will he try to form a compromise as a conciliator? And again, two very enlightening papers, and stimulating in the sense that they open up some questions for the future of Japanese trade policy.
Thank you very much, Professor Munger. Considering the limit of time, I think we should now open the discussion to the floor. I'd like to receive some questions from our audience. Thank you for your patience for 1.5 hours. If you would like to ask any question or comment, say some comment, please let us know your name and affiliation. Anybody? Okay. Then while you are thinking, probably I should ask Professor Yamagami and Professor Sasada to respond to Professor Munger's comments and questions. Okay. Will you make it rather short, maybe five minutes each?
Thank you for your comment, Professor Munger. I both submitted paper in writing in advance to him, but what I presented here is a condensed short version because of time limits to. So some part relating to open regionalism, gut compatibility, those are not explained here, but I may just briefly touch upon. Yes, Bogo goals to liberalize trade and investment by 2010 for developing countries and developing countries by 2020. It's very ambitious challenge, but it's a policy goal and political commitment. How to realize that political commitment is up to the group, and that is actually what is through midterm report, and also how to course of action agenda, and those are the steps. And yes, to the extent that voluntarily implemented by each country is limited. And to avail the result to other countries based on most favored nations treatment is desirable, but perhaps free ride is always the issue, and the United States is very suspicious about that approach, and that's correct. But nonetheless, East Asian countries, or including in the United States, up until the mid-1990s, that would be the most appropriate approach so as not to damage the global multilateral trade regime under GATT. Well, in order to secure GATT compatibility, as you mentioned, under GATT 24, liberalization within that group should be complete, or virtually all the restrictions should be removed. The question is, virtually, to what extent? 90%, 95%? Well, that's again up to the interpretation of each country and each group. And so, say, ice may be shared between the United States and Korea, or if ice is shared, potentiality between US and Japan may increase. Those arguments arises. But again, that is the result of negotiation, and you are right. If complete liberalization is to be achieved, there's no negotiation, just to be. But among which group, or to what extent, well, my country is something very sensitive in this, only in this area or something. That's still subject to negotiation. So that part of negotiation remains. That's precarious. Now, first your question on the status of Republic of Korea. That's quite interesting. Not only in the trade area, but also environment trade area and others. Republic of Korea is already classified as developing countries, as you mentioned. But nonetheless, all APEC members, including Korea itself, they recognize we are not developing countries. Nonetheless, target year for Republic of Korea may not be 2010. That's the perception of Korea. Maybe 2012, 2013, or something, seeing what United States and Japan do. And also for Korea, FTA between the United States and Korea, FTA between Europe and Korea. Major part of trade is already covered, except trade between Japan and Korea and Korea, China. Import tariff to Japan is relatively, or perhaps the cheapest in the world, maybe around 2%. Only exception is rice and some agricultural products. So in order to export from Korea or EU, even without any trade agreement, tariff impediment is very low, and there will be no problem for them. That, ironically, that hinders the trade negotiation between Japan and EU. EU doesn't have any incentive to negotiate FTA with Japan because there's virtually no tariff rate problem. While from the side of Japan, some products to the EU, maybe 66% tariff set for electronic goods or something like that. While export from Korea is down to zero, then some competition issue arises, and therefore Japanese side proposed to conclude FTA with EU as soon as possible, while EU side raised the issue. No, tariff rate is not the issue. If you don't bring in another issue, not tariff issue, another issue, standard or something, otherwise there's no incentive for EU to negotiate. But that's state of affairs, and that forges the basis of international relations. Linkage with something different would be certainly legitimate. Try to accommodate all different things as much as possible and to make things level equally. That kind of art and persuading to that right to the people in order to capture the support for such a move. That's the role of politics in any countries, and more and more difficult in developed countries. So that's the problem, not only for Japan, but for the United States and for European countries, not for this trade issue, but for sovereign risks and all of them. Now, finally, your observation. Resemblance of 1990s and today. Yes, I have all frequently things. Standstill of GATT negotiations. No prospect for WTO. Some regional initiative should be substituted for standstill at GATT. Similarly today, what is different is position of developed countries or EU and the United States. In global negotiation under GATT round, when EU and United States came to terms on reduction of export subsidy, agricultural subsidy, abruptly, suddenly, all other countries came to the terms based on US, EU compromise. No country, Japan, Korea, or any other country, didn't want to be blamed that you spoiled this negotiation once US, EU came to terms. This, development round, a few more years ago, EU and the United States came to terms, largely came to terms on this negotiation. But that didn't prevent India or Brazil or other countries to keep the things going. Further agricultural reduction is needed. Otherwise, it's meaningless to come to the terms. And there's no hope for early exit of this negotiation. And therefore, compared to 1990s, the need for second best or regional or bilateral trade is more needed for developed countries, including Korea and other countries. That's my perception and understanding.
Thank you very much, Professor Sal.
Thank you, Professor Munger, for very insightful comments and interesting questions. Let me answer to some of those questions. First of all, you mentioned that you asked a question how the fact that the DPJ has changed is related to other factors like lack of leadership or absence of party discipline. I think it's closely related to each other. The fact that the Japanese government or Japanese politics doesn't have the strong leadership is partly because, in the current condition, it's partly because the ruling party is highly divided on this issue. And it's partly because of the fact that some members are from urban district and some are from a rural district. And so that makes it very difficult for the party leader to have strong party leadership and also to impose some form of party discipline on trade policies. If they are to do so, it's possible. I mean, practically speaking, it's possible for the party to impose party discipline, which they did in the past in some other areas. But if they do so, there's a possibility that the party will split into smaller parties. Some members, most definitely, those members who are elected from the rural district may decide to spread out from the party. And I think that's the concern of the party leader and making it very difficult for the party to do so. And second, another actor, bureaucrat, as you mentioned, is a very important actor in the Japanese politics. And in the past, like you mentioned, they have been acting very active in, especially in agricultural ministry. They are trying to sabotage the government's effort to implement free trade policies. And they used to use what's called the Zoku politicians within the LDP party. the local politicians or politicians who specialize in certain policy areas, and you have agricultural Zoku politicians or construction Zoku politicians. They used to use those LDP members to sort of defend their interests. And now they don't have that, right? The LDP is gone, and there aren't that many sort of Zoku politicians within the DPJ, but it seems that they are developing new sort of Zoku politicians within DPJ, and like I mentioned in a slide, some of those politicians who are elected from a rural district, they are having very close relationship with agricultural ministry, and so they are replacing the function of the LDPs of politicians nowadays, I think. And so why the farmers are convinced by the DPJ, and why did they vote for the DPJ? I think this income support program was a big factor. I think they were convinced by the party that it will provide a lot of benefit to farmers and protect their business and so forth. And I think it's a big factor. And another question of yours was that now some of the income support programs are implemented, and has there been any effect yet? I think it's an interesting point that now that system is implemented, so there should be some kind of effect. Perhaps the changes in perspectives of the farmers, maybe they are less objective or less, I should say, they oppose the FTA less so than before, because now they have income support system. It's kind of hard to tell at this moment. It seems to me that they want the best things from LDP policy and the DPJ policy. They are happy that they have the income support system. And the best scenario for them, I think, is to have income support system and also to have price support system continue, because the Japanese government seems to be unable to remove price support system as they promised. So if they have income support system and a price support system, that would be great for the farmers. And then they are trying to reach this goal, seems to me right now. But and then at the same time, party is having a hard time implementing free trade policies these days. So it seems to go in the favor of the farmers at this point. And also, the Ozawa children is, as you said, it's a very interesting factor in DPJ. And many of Ozawa children did win in rural district, and then that was the purpose. I mean, that was something Ozawa intended to have. He specifically targeted some rural districts which have been dominated by LDP politicians for years and years. And then he sent some young, some of them are young and promising candidates, some were kind of attractive because of their education background or the name recognition and so forth. And then they were very successful in winning in those rural districts. And so they seem to be acting very in favor of the farmers, because they just won an election in 2009. Their total basis is still weak, and so in order for them to keep winning, they have to continue to get support from the farmers in the rural district, and so they are very sensitive to rural interest. And how many Ozawa children are from rural district? I would say it's kind of hard to tell. It's kind of hard to tell, first of all, who are Ozawa children. And there are some very obvious cases, some very loyal Ozawa children, but there are some politicians who are sometimes considered as an Ozawa children, but they seems to be rather less loyal to parent, Mr. Ozawa. So it's kind of hard to tell, but I would say the vast majority of them are from rural district, and that's because Mr. Ozawa intended to have his children go to rural district and win. And lastly, what to expect from Mr. Noda? It's very hard for me to say at this moment because it's still unclear who's who in the cabinet, and then still some members are switching, some important figures are still switching from some anti-FTA person to pro-FTA person. It's kind of hard to predict, but I can give you two scenarios. In the best scenario, Mr. Noda can perhaps sort of develop or to achieve a ceasefire between the mainstream DPJ members and Ozawa faction. And they would agree to implement some of the policies that are advocated by the party during the campaign, which is the strong demand made by the Ozawa faction. The Ozawa faction wanted the party to go back to the manifesto and then maintain their basic policies and then implement them. If they can do so, they'll probably implement or finish the income support system, implementation of the income support system, and also remove the price support system, and then perhaps remove trade barriers as they promised during the election. The worst scenario would be Mr. Noda would fail in the same trap that Mr. Khan failed during his administration. Mr. Noda failed to win a peace between the mainstream and the faction, and then we'll just repeat the same thing again during the Khan administration. Which scenario will come in the future, it's very hard to tell, but I'll just end my response here.
Okay, thank you very much. We spent most of the time already, but if you really like to ask questions or comment, we'd like to accept one or two questions, comments.
I would just, Aaron Webb from George Mason University. I would just like to briefly ask all of you if you think that adding China into this discussion, as was the original plan, would make it more difficult, make it more skeptical. So I think each country has a worry that trade liberalization could undermine the current political power structure. Each country will probably be pursuing strategies of currency weakening over the coming decades, which all three can't do at once. And all three countries seem like they're at the center of both regional and global approaches to globalization. So if we had more China in this discussion, would we be even more downhearted as we left today?
Okay, one more question. Are you all satisfied? Okay. Who would like to answer the question?
Well, I just briefly touched upon China is sticking to the idea to move regional cooperation, regional trade liberalization based on ASEAN plus 3, not inviting the United States in. Although China thinks the United States is very important trade partner and also security and else. Now, first, I may briefly explain my perception on Chinese people, how Chinese leaders view the Chinese situation. Chinese leaders often having been telling all of us we should learn from history. And Chinese leaders certainly learning from Chinese history, how all Chinese dynasty came to end. And certainly they understand the necessity to satisfy local presence and rural area in inland China and so on and so forth. And therefore, China is difficult to conclude FTA, including agricultural products. If cheaper agricultural products comes into China, the satisfaction of impoverished rural peasants would increase. And that's a difficulty. But knowing that, therefore, domestic-oriented development in the inland area is the priority number one for China, and to a certain extent it's succeeding. And seeing from this Chinese continuing growth, surrounding countries or countries nearby find opportunity here to link their own economic growth through export to China with Chinese rise. But at the same time, China has been learning from the history how old Qing dynasty failed. A few years ago, there was an article on International Herald Tribune in Japan, so certainly either in New York Times or Washington Post, the same article was on, and that article says, brisk fall of China. That's not of today. How China fell in 1838 when small warfare rose to Britain. Piecemeal land concession was forced to Britain and Russia was in Japan. Now, when the fall began in 1839, perhaps more than 1/3 of global GDP belonged to China, and for the preceding 5 centuries. When Deng Xiaoping moved ahead for open and reform and opening in 1979, Chinese global GDP in the world is 1%. Why this fall? Because of the defeat, military defeat. Therefore, again, learning from past history, China is increasing military equipment, and while saying this is not for military attack, but just for the self-defense and so on, so forth. Continuing military equipment, and that's perceived quite differently from other countries. Now, all countries want United States be in East Asia. That kind of perception promoted the invitation of the United States to East Asia Summit. Countries like Malaysia, not only Vietnamese, Philippines, those countries which have some difficulties, Malaysia, Indonesia, and other countries also want the United States, US continuous presence in this region, in East Asia. So that's why.
For my part, I would have to answer to your question depending on who you ask. I mean, which actor you were talking about. And in Japan, like I mentioned, there are pro-FTA people and anti-FTA people. And the Japanese industry, for instance, they welcome the fact that China is rising, and it gives a lot of business opportunity for Japan. And so, because China is rising and developing, it's giving a lot of opportunities for Japanese business, and therefore it gives another reason for the Japanese industry to call for free trade policies. But if you look at the farmers, the anti-FTA side, they're concerned about the fact that China, they produce a lot of agricultural products, and then they actually export a lot to Japan. If you go to Japanese grocery stores, you can find a lot of vegetables, fruits, and so forth produced in China. So it's slightly hard to say in a definitive tone, but because Japan is already open to Chinese product, and China doesn't produce a type of rice, the short grain rice that Japanese consumers consume, and so it doesn't. The Japanese rice producers, I would assume, they are less concerned about opening up Japanese agriculture market to China, because first of all, it's already open to a large extent, and also there won't be much significant increase in rice import from China, at least in the short period. However, United States does produce short grain type of rice that Japanese consumers will buy, and therefore it's a very strong concern, serious concern for Japanese farmers, and they want a Japanese rice market to be opened for U.S. agricultural producers.
Mark, would you like to say?
Just very briefly say that, well, there's one, I think for the Japanese and the Japanese government dealing with China directly, the main issue is not opening the market anymore. The main issue is somehow enforcing the rules, right? Making sure that China complies with the rules that it is actually committed to. And the best venue for that simply is the WTO, because in a bilateral agreement, I mean, we know the record of dispute settlement in bilateral agreements is that there's a binational panel and everybody votes along national lines, right? That's sort of the NAFTA experience. And so that wouldn't get anywhere if you had a Japan-China trade agreement, or even a trilateral trade agreement with Korea, and then you had a dispute over this. This is also what's been, mainly Métis people have told me that they actually are not particularly interested in an agreement with China because there'd be no way of enforcing it. So it'd be better if China actually, if China complies with all its WTO commitments, then most Japanese industries would be perfectly happy with that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Considering the economic as well as political stagnation of both United States and Japan, and probably China is not the exception either. It is suffering serious inflation, and it is suffering from the dilemma of inflation and the maintaining export drive, keeping renminbi relatively cheap to US dollar. So I believe that there aren't much of time left to allow drifting of regional trade negotiation, which we had the last 2 decades or so. What is necessary is serious national debate to let the leaders achieve burden sharing and benefit sharing of regional integration. And by so doing, I think we can break the political stagnation, which unfortunately we have both in the United States and Japan. Thank you very much for your cooperation.